It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the Race and Public Policy Practicum. The Institute on Research in Race and Public Policy is a campus-wide research institute which is committed to advancing and deepening the work done on this campus around questions of race and ethnicity and related questions of gender, sexuality, age, ability, and the other markers of social difference and the sites of social oppression. At IRRPP, we're very proud to do our part in service of UIC's mission to make sure that the things that happen on this campus, the teaching, the research, the service, the work that happens on this campus is accountable to real people living their real lives. So this afternoon's discussion will focus on that part of our work at IRRPP that we're deeply committed to around questions of public policy, work that translates research findings into action, and ways to do research that really matter in the ways that people live, the opportunities that they have, the futures that they face, etc. We've invited two uniquely engaged scholars, scholar activists, if you will, whose work is, in fact, that kind of work, to talk with us this afternoon. We chose them. They do work on Black and Latino males because they do work that really matters in the real world. We've also invited an activist educator who will join the panel and moderate the discussion after. We've invited her because of her impressive on-the-ground work in Chicago with the populations of young people that are, excuse the word, that are the subjects of the research that we'll hear about. So first we'll hear from the policy researchers, beginning with Waldo Johnson. Professor Johnson is a faculty member in the School of the Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. He's the immediate past director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture on that campus. His work focuses on fragile families, the physical and psychosocial health of African American males, and fatherhood programs. He's received major funding from both public and private foundations to support that work, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Ford Foundation, National Institutes of Mental Health, etc. And he's been recognized by a number of professional organizations for his groundbreaking work on Black males, subordinated masculinity, and gender issues that are impacting contemporary African American communities. Professor Johnson. Next we'll hear from Professor Pedro Nogueira, the Peter L. Agnew, we'll maybe find out who that was, professor of education at, long story, at New York University. He's also the director of the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education and co-directs the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Education in Metropolitan Settings. Dr. Noriega is an urban sociologist whose research focuses on the ways that schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, widely known for his work on school reform, youth violence, the achievement gap. He's one of the leading scholars on race, ethnicity, and education in the United States. Both of them have recent books. They're on sale by the UIC bookstore. They will be available to talk with you after and sign the books if you're interested. They'll each talk for about 20 minutes about their research and the policy implications of their work. After they speak, Mia Henry, who's sitting in the audience, we'll hear from activist educator Mia Henry, and we're delighted that she's joining us this afternoon. Ms. Henry is the founding executive director of the esteemed Chicago Freedom School, an organization by most accounts which is one of the bright lights in youth organizing in this country. It's dedicated to cultivating youth-led social change and intergenerational community organizing. The Chicago Freedom School is only the most recent leadership role that Ms. Henry has assumed. She's worked with the Mikvah Challenge, with Facing History in Ourselves. She was a high school teacher, highly sought after trainer and consultant, and one of the most committed youth activists that I know. We're fortunate at UIC that she's also teaching right now as a visiting lecturer in the College of Education. Ms. Henry will follow the research presentations with some questions and points for discussion based on her expertise working with young people in Chicago. After we hear some dialogue among the panelists, facilitated, moderated, probed, pushed by Ms. Henry, we'll follow with questions from the audience. We invite you after that to join us for a reception. So please join me in welcoming our three guests to IRRPP Practicum Institute on Race and Public Policy.
Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Professor Ritchie and the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy for this gracious invitation. Perhaps there's a part of me that actually still wonders that, given that I'm sharing the podium with Pedro, why is it that I'm standing here, but I'm certainly gracious and pleased at the fact that I get to go before him, given the range and the breadth of scholarship that he represents in the work that he does. But it is indeed a pleasure to be here and to see so many familiar faces, as well as to have the opportunity to become familiar with others. And those familiar faces include former students. I see Kiana Cryer back there in the back, who was actually a doctoral student here in the School of Social Work. And I had the pleasure of having her in one of my classes at SSA. She's a very aspiring and a gifted doctoral student who is promising in terms of her own scholarship focus on African-American fathers. And one of the contributors to my volume, Professor Connie Dallas from the School of Nursing. I'm pleased to see her here, as well as Dave Stovall and a variety of other people. I don't want to start naming names because I'm going to forget someone, miss someone, but indeed it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to actually follow the directions that Michelle Boyd asked me to follow. I guess this will be a new thing for me, because like so many of us in the academy, we often take academic liberty in a lot of instances. But given in the advertisement of this particular symposium, the question was raised, how is it that research scholars actually influence policy? I'm going to attempt to try to kind of talk about what, in my limited role, I've tried to do in ways to do so, by first kind of talking about my scholarship, and then kind of talking about the examples of the kinds of things that we might do. But I'll be, even in talking about it, I'm going to even begin by saying Henry Aaron, who was a former president of the Association for Public Policy and Management, observed some years ago that history suggests that with regard to presidential policy, which is perhaps the ultimate kind of policy you'd like to influence as a scholar, that the president's priorities are far more likely to shape the research agenda of scholars than it is for them to shape his agenda. And he was talking specifically about economists. I'm not an economist. I don't claim to be an economist. But I do think that there is some wisdom in what he said, in terms of there is some real question in terms of our ability to really measure how much we actually do influence policy. That said, that should, in many ways, as I'm very honored that Professor Ritchie would recognize me as an engaged or activist scholar. There are not many people who I think are often kind of recognized as such, and in being recognized as such, one of the things that you always think about is that conducting research alone does not necessarily yield for you the kind of influence that you'd ideally like to have with regard to the public sphere, the private sphere, whatever spheres you're trying to engage. And particularly focus on a population that I have chosen to examine, and that is also shared by my colleague Pedro, looking at the plights of disadvantaged males. I mean, the way in which disadvantaged males, whether we're talking about African American or Latino males, enter into the public discourse is often in ways that are not very complimentary, and the ways in which they are often characterized are less than flattering, and often the kinds of ways in which people kind of think about what are the things that they ought to be doing, or the things that we're willing to do for them, are not necessarily the things that are the most useful in terms of advancing their well-being. So I do think that it is interesting to kind of think about this in the context of, say, presidential policy. If we look at the last 3 presidents, including our current president, during the Clinton administration with regard to males, and particularly non-custodial fathers, there were initiatives that were created designed to enhance their involvement in the lives of their families, which were abruptly ended when Bush came to office with marriage initiatives that were designed in many ways to try to connect families of unwed children born out of wedlock in ways. And as we kind of think about what becomes the kind of policy focus on this particular population as it is related to the Obama administration, Obama's ascendancy to the U.S. presidency in many ways ignited what I would observe as many naive media observations that his emergence would serve as an exemplar of what African American males can and should aspire to, without really much consideration of his vast human capital assets that essentially distance him in terms of individual as well as collective achievement among most males in American society, or and for that fact, the world. And so to kind of go from a really deficit perspective, which is really in many ways which shaped the kind of policy prescriptions of the previous 2 administrations, to all of a sudden kind of saying we can now reach the top, all in some ways kind of represent a naivete that is very much prevalent in terms of what it is that really would be most beneficial in terms of advancing the well-being of African American males. I think that in large measure, Beth was able to capture the scholarship that I've sought to do as a researcher. I started by doing dissertation work looking at unwed fathers, looking at the ways in which they are actually involved in the lives of their children that often escape the more traditional ways in which sometimes empirical social science research is conducted, as a means of kind of figuring out what are some of the factors that promote as well as inhibit their engagement, as opposed to starting from the perspective that they are uninvolved in a rather overall sense. And so beyond that, as I try to think about the ways in which I've thought about going forth with regard to my research career, that in many ways might shape policy, I can think about it on multiple levels. First of all, in terms of basic research. So beyond the kind of research that I try to do independent, in some ways that is reflective of the volume that's for sale here today, I've also been fortunate to participate in some initiatives at the federal level, as well as some private initiatives that in many ways would ideally, as a result of developing the research, contribute to ways in which policy might be influenced. So for example, over the last year or so, I, as well as Pedro, was involved in a project that was supported by the California Endowment, which sought to look at the ways in which communities would improve the health of males of color, and particularly focused on boys and young adult males. And I think the California Endowment, in collaboration with the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute at Berkeley Law School, recognized how racial and ethnic and gender disparities in community health, education, and economic outcomes develop, how they persist over time, and how they have come to have a profound, long-lasting effect on American families on a national level as well as at the community level. So this project, which engaged academics as well as policymakers and practitioners who are working on the ground, led to an edited volume in which the authors sought to look at the ways in which they might build healthier communities across the nation through a focus on young men of color. My contribution to this particular volume was a chapter that I was fortunate to co-author with David Pate, a social work professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Social Work, and Jarvis Gibbons, who's a second-year doctoral student at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, in the Department of African American Studies. And our chapter focused on the media depictions of the Darian Abbott case. Darian Abbott being the young male in the Roseland community who was beaten to death. We co-authored a chapter entitled Big Boys Don't Cry, Black Boys Don't Feel. And we were particularly interested in trying to examine how the media examined the social construction of masculinity in urban poor communities, and how that, along with profound economic disadvantage, in many ways kind of shaped the economic opportunities that young males might partake. What we found really interesting in our chapter was that Darian Abbott came to the forefront in a rather victimized way, but Darian Abbott was victimized on a daily basis. The fact that he attended Finger High School because the public high school in his community was closed to become a military academy, which meant that he had to cross neighborhood boundaries, which those of you who've grown up in Chicago know that there are always profound difficulties in terms of doing that, particularly for males. And how it was that in this particular situation, the characterization of the perpetrators who actually beat Darian Abbott to death was in question many times, because the initial people who were charged, of the four, two charges were dismissed because what you come to learn is that eyewitness testimony is often the worst kind of testimony. But what is not kind of examined in prior to our chapter is the way in which the context in which violence occurs in many neighborhoods, combined with the lack of economic opportunities within the neighborhoods, and a variety of other kinds of things come to bear in a particular kind of way that create these kinds of situations. Also, the fact that after this young man was beaten to death in the presence of approximately 50 other individuals, it's not very clear that there was any kind of mental health intervention for those who had just witnessed this beating. And this is also profound also in terms of the recognition that the fact that fights occur on a daily basis, but very seldom do these fights often result in death. I'm also right now involved in a project that's being conducted by the Urban Institute entitled Race, Place, and Poverty, and it is an urban ethnographer symposium on low-income men. And over the next 18 months, what we will do is begin to develop research profiles that will lead to a symposium that looks at the current and the evolving research in support of family formation and stability, focus on the role that young men play in communities. Also, I'm involved with a project through Mathematica, Policy Research Associates, where I'm one of the consultants on the national evaluation of the recent fatherhood assistant grants. So in this particular project, what we will do is to do a longitudinal evaluation of the projects around the country. But what's even more interesting, there will be 2 qualitative studies that look more closely at some of the human capital processes that often go unnoticed in large-scale survey studies. From the standpoint of local work, I'm leading an evaluation of an adolescent parenting program with Access Health Networks here in Chicago. Access received a grant from the Office of Adolescent Parenting Programs. And in this particular project, we're working, the intervention focuses on pregnant teens ages 15 to 18. And in the project, these pregnant teens receive maternal and child health services during their pregnancy. But this project is located in 20 of the sites, and in 10 of those sites, we're actually providing intensive services to the fathers of the young mothers. So the idea is to look whether or not those particular sites where fathers get these intensive services actually improve the outcomes for mother and child over time. Finally, some of this work also occurs in collaboration with other researchers. Both Pedro and I belong to a scholars network that was organized by the Ford Foundation that examines masculinity and the well-being of African American men. And this network, which is made up of academics, is focused on the idea of influencing social policy on low-income African American men, trying to also think about ways to generate new forms of media coverage on African American men and infusing ideas into foundation circles as well as domestic policy. And most recently, I was invited to join the Welfare and Family Self-Sufficiency Technical Working Group for the Administration for Children and Families. And in this role, this working group actually has the opportunity to review and to advise the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at HHS on the research projects that they're doing and to give consultation in terms of new directions. At a recent meeting, for example, there was a discussion about culture and whether or not there should be additional work done on culture. And one of the things that I suggested was that when we think about culture in the context of families, we also need to think about in terms of in service delivery, what is how service delivery culture that's designed to engage males should look very different from the way human services designed to provide services to females should look. And so in ways where we can begin to kind of think about how we broaden this and to kind of think about culture not in the kind of traditional ways, but in ways that may represent opportunities to advance our understanding of the ways in which we can engage those who are most in need become really important. Like all others, I have little evidence to kind of say that any of these efforts that I'm engaged in really have a solid or an exacting impact on policy. But to the extent that we are able to talk to multiple audiences about our research findings, to the extent that we're able to continue to receive inquiries about the research in the framing of programs and even research initiatives, I still remain optimistic and hopeful that this work is useful in a very engaging way, in ways that not only seek to, in many ways, kind of advance our knowledge for simply the sake of knowledge, but also, more importantly, for ways that really do change the way in which the lived experiences of those that we study actually are improved. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I want to thank Beth and Michelle for making my visit possible. Thank all of you for coming out. One of several visits to the University of Illinois Chicago for me, and so especially given I have lots of good friends in the audience, it feels like home. Let me start by describing a recent visit to Emory University in Atlanta, where I was invited to give a talk on the new directions or changes in federal education policy that I thought were needed. And I'm used to that. So, so I gave the talk, and which consisted largely of a critique of No Child Left Behind and some arguments about what new direction we should be going in. And I waited around to talk to people afterwards, and there was an older black woman who was very patiently waiting to talk to me. She had a cane, and she sat there and she waited almost a good hour for the group to leave. And then she sat there and she said, I agree with 50% of what you said and disagree with 50%. I said, okay, so let's talk about the part you disagree with, right? So she says, well, I can't quite put my finger on it. She says, but it sounds like you were talking about post-racialism. I said, really? I said, what gave you that idea? She said, well, I said, I can't put my finger on it. But something about the way you talked about these issues didn't sit well with me. I said, well, it's interesting. I find that odd. I said, I write explicitly about race in a lot of my work. And I started citing some books. She said, yeah, well, you didn't talk about that today, right? You talked about policy. And I didn't hear you talking about racism. I said, well, at one point, remember, I said that in this country, it will soon be the case that children of color, the young children of color, will be supporting old white people in their retirement. Because that's the way Social Security works. And so, in fact, old white people should be the biggest advocates of educating children of color right now. She said, yeah, that was one of the parts I liked. But she said, the rest I had problems with. So I got a little defensive, and someone then spoke up and said, no, you should read his work. He talks about race. I said, so then I thought about it. I said, okay. Then I found out she was a SNCC activist. And I remembered, I'm in Atlanta. And I think what she was basically trying to say to me was that I didn't name specifically the problem of racism and the way it drives these disparities and the neglect that we see in public education. And I both understand her reaction and her criticism, and at the same time, I'm wary of it. And I'll tell you why. And I'll now describe yet another experience. A few years back, and some of the younger people in the audience won't remember this far back, but when President Clinton was still in office, he had launched a national conversation on race. Okay? because he thought, he'd done an official apology about slavery, and then he, with Chris Edley, a colleague of mine at Bolt Law School, started a national conversation about race. And everywhere they had this conversation, it broke down into people yelling and people fighting, and it just was chaos. So they had one of those episodes in Bay Area where I was living at the time, and they had me on the radio to explain why. Why does a conversation about race always break down into chaos? I said, well, that's because we don't even know what race is. We don't know who belongs in which category. So as soon as we have a conversation about race, we get confused. And we don't even know what we're talking about the same things. I said, second of all, while we think we know what racism is, the racists today are phantoms. Because no one's willing to admit to being a racist anymore. It's not like the old days when they would just come out and tell you, I'm a racist, I hate you. They are undercover. And it's much more difficult to find out and identify who the racists are that we need to go after. I said, so what we really should be talking about is racial disparities. Because racial disparities are concrete, they're measurable, they show up in everything, every aspect of life in America. And I would argue that if we focus on racial disparities, we would actually make more progress than having an abstract conversation about race. That's been more or less my approach to this issue for the last 20 years and more. It's not that I don't focus on race, I do. But I also focus on class. Because I think that we can't really understand the problems facing black males if we not only focus on class, but we also got to focus on gender. And the ways in which these three different categories come together to influence the phenomena associated with black males in America, or Latino males in America. And so, while I think that race is especially important that we understand it, I also think it's important that we are skeptical of it. Skeptical because of its history. Because the very category of race in America has historically been used as a means to subjugate. And it's totally arbitrary and totally political. Because as many of us know, black folks in this country were defined by the one-drop rule, which was not even the same from state to state. So if you were 1/8 black, you were black in Virginia, but you could simply move over to West Virginia where it was only 1/16. And in 1980, the state of Louisiana said, guess what? Even 1/32 black makes you black in Louisiana. So a whole lot of white folks got scared because they've been passing for generations. But it shows you how easily manipulated these categories are. Armenians petitioned to stop being Asians. They said, we are white. Look at us. But prior to 1910, they were not considered white, so until there was a law passed that Armenians could be white. Indians said, well, shoot. Armenians are white, we should be white too. They said, I'm not talking about Native Americans, I'm talking about Indians from the subcontinent. They said, no, you're not white. The longer and the closer we look at the history of race as a category, the more we realize this category has been used for one purpose and one purpose only, to subjugate, to rationalize slavery, conquest, and various kinds of domination. Now, at the same time, we know that these categories are not simply a figment of our imagination. Because, and this is where I think many of my colleagues who think of race as simply a social construct that needs to be dismissed as such, I think miss the point. And the reason why I think racial disparities are so important is because even if we can be skeptical of it, and even if we can recognize that very often the categories don't really speak to who we are. Toni Morrison says that race is both profoundly important in determining who you are and totally irrelevant about understanding who a person is. Talk about skepticism. And this is a person who's written extensively for more of her life about the plight of black people in America through her novels. And so I would say that even as we focus on issues like racial disparities, which has been central to the focus of my work, particularly as it pertains to public policy, we've still got to be skeptical. Skeptical of the categories. Skeptical of how they're being used. I realized that when I was at Berkeley and we were looking at how affirmative action was playing out on the campus, and I noticed from looking at the data, that Native Americans had the highest income among all students at UC Berkeley. I said, well, how could this be? Are they all casino owners? What's going on? How are the wealthiest Native Americans in the country coming to Berkeley? No. It was because many white students knew it was to their advantage to claim a Native American heritage when they applied, because they had a great-great-grandparent who was half Cherokee, and so suddenly they were Native American, but they were no more Native American than lots of other folks who weren't. But they knew it was convenient to use that box when it came to admissions. So I remain skeptical about it, even as I remain focused on it. I remain focused on it because I also know that when we ignore race, and one of the societies that shows us the dangers of ignoring race most clearly is Cuba. Because Cuba, you can't study race in Cuba because there's no recording of it. Not in the official documents. You can study the history of African people. You can study Afro-Caribbean religion, the Afro-African religions that have been developed in Cuba. You can study lots of things related to the African presence, but you can't find out how many black people attend the University of Havana because they keep no records. And having visited the University of Havana, one of the things you start to notice is not a whole lot of black people there. So one of the things you start to realize is that not counting makes it very easy to deny and to pretend that we've achieved post-racialism without ever having addressed the continued denial of opportunity that's highly associated with race in many societies, not just the United States. And so over and over again, what we're reminded of is that race, while still important to organizing society, is also highly problematic. That's the reason why when William Julius Wilson wrote his book, The Declining Significance of Race, it set such an uproar. I told Bill Wilson, I said, you know what, you should have named it The Growing Significance of Class. Because that's really what the book was about. But by calling it The Declining Significance of Race, people said, oh, he's saying race is not an issue. That's really not what Bill Wilson was saying. But he was saying that the black folks who are concentrated in the South Side and the Robert Taylor homes and the Ida B. Wells homes, for whom civil rights and affirmative action has not resulted in a change, they got a different set of issues. And if we don't address those issues, what we will find is the society will just grow more and more unequal, even as we see certain people become professors and even presidents, which adds again to the complexity. We have Latinos who cannot be easily categorized, can they? Because Latinos fall in all the boxes. You can be white Latino, Asian Latino, you can be Middle Eastern Latino. Got all kinds. Because Latino is not even a national category, it's a cultural category. And even with that, we don't know where to put Brazilians then. They don't speak Spanish. And then we put 2/3 of the world's population into the Asian category. Talk about nonsense. What does an Indian have in common with a Samoan, have in common with a Filipino, have in common with a Korean? They don't think they have anything in common. But once they come here, they're made into Asians. Because we're constantly making these categories. And so they do take on a life of their own. And that's important because they serve political purposes as a basis for group mobilization. So I understand and recognize the importance of that, even as I remain skeptical. And I remain skeptical because I know of their origins and I know of the dangers of racialization. Because when we allowed ourselves to see things simply through the lens of race, we almost invariably take on the assumptions about race. I was in a debate right after, some of you will remember when the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, he'd gone into hiatus, and then he finally did his National Press Club speech, which many people couldn't understand, was kind of incoherent. And at one point during that speech, he asserted something about black children learning differently, a black learning style. And I was asked to go on to National Public Radio with Karen Hale Benson, a black educator who I respect a great deal, about whether or not there was a black learning style. And she insisted there was, and I said, I don't think so. Because there's incredible diversity amongst black people. And when we start to make generalizations, broad generalizations about learning styles, about cultures, we actually reinforce and reify that very category, that very box they'd like to put us in. And so I want to encourage us to exercise skepticism of the box, even as we continue to acknowledge phenotype matters. Dark-skinned people experience prejudice and bias that lighter-skinned people don't experience. If you happen to look black and you're stopped by the police, then you're going to get a very different treatment than those who don't, in many cases. So we have to both recognize and understand the ongoing reality of race, even as we recognize that the categories themselves are political and serve largely a political purpose. I'm running out of time, so let me say this, that I think particularly in universities, we have grown very accustomed to using race as a basis to organize ourselves, and allowed ourselves to accept marginalization as a result. You know, back in the 1960s, having a black studies department was something worth fighting over. And I wasn't there in the 60s, but I was there in the 70s. And I was fighting over it. I was fighting to create a third world center. But in 2011, does it make sense to have a third world center when the third world doesn't even call itself the third world anymore? And should we be satisfied with the Black Studies Department or Latino Studies Department or Asian Studies? Shouldn't we really be saying, we want to see black people in the English department and in the physics department and in every department? We want the whole thing. We don't just want a little piece. We want to be out of the margin, into the center, because by the year 2041, we will be the majority. And we can't be satisfied with a little department here or there. One of my colleagues at Berkeley, a very curmudgeonly, not very touchy-feely kind of guy, economist, he was talking to one of the students, and she was explaining what she was interested in. She was a lesbian Latina. And he's listening to her and he says, you know what, I will be happy when I finally meet a student of color who's interested in doing something other than studying themselves. So she came running to me crying, said how offended she was. I said, you know what, he has a point. I said, what? I said, yeah, he has a point. I said, because if we only study ourselves, who studies how schools get financed? Who studies how policy gets made? Who studies the big issues that white students don't feel limited by because they think they can study the big issues while we study ourselves? Listen, we've got to do the work of studying our experience, our history, our culture, but if we allow the larger issues to be ceded to others, then we are silencing those larger conversations about how money gets spent, about how policy gets made. We can't afford to do that. We've got to be willing to push from the margin to the center. Right now, this country is going through massive demographic upheaval. It's changing even as we sit here. By 2020, the majority of children in this country will be children of color. Majority of children. Our schools are still taught largely by white teachers who often cannot relate to those children, don't even understand what it means to educate those children. We not only have to deal with the race issues involved, we also have to deal with the practical issue of what it means to prepare schools to deal with this demographic shift that's occurring. That to me is not a question we have it on the margin. We have to bring it right to the center. I keep saying the problem of African American males is not a black male problem. It's an American problem. It will only be solved when America understands that when you allow 50% of black males to be incarcerated, when you allow so many to be denied educational opportunities, when you allow the murder rates to continue as they have, then not only are black men imperiled, our society's imperiled. Lonnie Guinier says that we have to see the black male problem as the canary in the mine. Who are the miners? Not other black folks, it's Americans are the miners. And part of the problem is that they don't realize that their fate is tied to what's happening to black men. So I would encourage us that even as we focus on race and try to bring issues related to race to the forefront, we not do it from a position on the margin, that we claim the center. We say those are American issues. Those are global issues, in fact. And as such, we need to then both reinterrogate and challenge the very categories that we've grown accustomed to, even as we focus on the ongoing problems and challenges that remain before us.
So I'm going to ask my first question from up here, but then I'm going to sit down and we'll talk and then we'll hear from all of you. And anyone who knows me is not going to be really that surprised by the types of questions that I'm asking. I work with young people every day, and I've been working with them for many years, and so I'm very interested, obviously, in the practical applications of the research, and my questions are going to be, I have 3 questions, and they're going to be rooted in this desire to know more about these practical applications. At the Freedom School, we have a social justice approach to youth development. We believe that when working with youth, so that they develop a social political analysis of the issues around them. They do organizing work through an anti-oppression lens and through a historical context. Certainly they've learned a lot about SNCC and other youth-led social movements in history. And that they have an opportunity to heal from the impact of oppression in their lives. And this oppression, of course, can come through racial oppression, but also all different forms of oppression based on their varying identities beyond race. So they have an opportunity to heal from what's called the social toxins. At the heart of it all, though, the young people are part of the decisions that affect them. And so essentially my first question for you is just given the complexities around talking about race and the issues and making these conversations relevant to policies that affect young black men and young Latino males, where are young black men and young Latino men entering the conversations about these policies that affect young black and Latino males? So I would just love to hear from you about where you see it happening in the field and the applications of your research to those kinds of conversations.
Individuals like myself will have limited ability to, even with the most convincing research, to draw as an organizer, as a researcher, or in whatever role I might be acting, without having the opportunity to have that information or that knowledge or that or whatever vetted in some way through youth leadership, and to have it vetted and then kind of filtered in ways so that it makes sense. Because often the ways in which I might kind of think about how things operate on the ground, given my involvement, may be very different from, and often is quite different from the way in which young people are experiencing those things today. Very much in terms of the age category, along with Pedro in terms of having been in college during the 70s. So I'm thinking that whatever I find that even in terms of doing research, before I even often take on a research topic, I'm very interested in going out into the community and talking about my ideas about a particular project to the young people that I'll be studying, because I'm very interested in knowing whether or not it has any utility, if it has any legs, so to speak, for them. And often what it does in many ways is not always necessarily kind of end up being shot down, but at minimum, it helps me to reframe it in ways that make it far more applicable in terms of something that has some utility and also something that can be used to galvanize the support and the involvement of those who will be affected by those policies.
So I would agree with a lot of what Walter just said. I think that young people need help developing their own ability to critique their situation. They need the tools, and one part of that is understanding history, which I think is so essential to developing a kind of critique of the current period we're in. We have done a lot of research in schools with young people where they become the researchers, and I've actually written a lot about how the perspective that young people have on their education can actually help to improve schools if the adults will actually listen to them. So I think that's a resource, but it has to be actively cultivated. I would also add here, though, that part of what we need to challenge and need to cultivate in young people is a sense of agency, a sense that they do not have to be victims of circumstance, which I think is so essential because the more you understand about the way society is organized, about the structure of our political economy, the more demoralized you can become. And sometimes you'll see that resignation setting in. And that always concerns me. How do we make sure that young people see themselves as potentially agents of change? I was asked, we do work with several schools on Rikers Island, the largest penal institution in the world, just out of New York City. And we have a debate program that we run there, and I was asked to speak there to a group of young men, about 300 of them, a couple years ago, and I was asked, they said, say something that will inspire these young men. I thought long and hard, what can I say that will inspire them? And I got there, after finally thought I had it, and so I said to them, listen, so there's a conspiracy to keep you here. There's a whole industry that's been developed around incarcerating people like you. There are towns that depend on their prisons for jobs. These guards who are here get paid well to keep you here. The guards start looking like, who's back this guy? And then I say, listen, my question to you is, are you part of the conspiracy too? Because the whole system doesn't work unless you make choices that will help you to get back. Well, that set off a very lively debate among the young men. Some of them said, well, I was framed, I was set up, I talked about their plans when they got out, how much responsibility they bore for where they were. Got so lively at some point that they got word that it was going on too long. My point in doing that was that we have got to get young people, particularly young men, to take a sense of ownership for their education, ownership for their fate, not wait for a president, a mayor, a governor, superintendent to come save us. We got to save ourselves. And we have to inspire them with the tools of critical analysis, but also with an understanding that it is through both individual and collective initiative that we can actually have an impact on what's happening to us right now. I'll just say one more thing. My colleague, blanking on his right name right now, Cornell, writes about the Harriet Tubman principle of agency. You know, Harriet Tubman here she was, woman, disabled, illiterate, freed more people from slavery than anyone else. Right? And she just thought about how tough it was. She probably, would have freed anybody. But when they asked her, how did you manage to free so many people? She said, I would have freed more had they not been afraid.
Yeah.
That's right.
So along those same lines, Pedro, I want to talk about this responsibility of adults, right, in working with young people. And the responsibility at the Freedom School, again, we do not only work with young people directly, but we also work with adults on how to be partners with young people in organizing. And so what are, just building on what you were just saying around what we have to do with young people, when you start talking about that, young people's eyes just start glazing over. And what is the responsibility? And this happens both of mentors of color, people who fashion themselves as mentors of color, and non-people of color. What is their responsibility in working with young males of color and making sure that we cultivate this, but not in a way that's not condescending to them, that does not devalue their experience, but really, really purposefully talks about their roles as agents of change. What do adults need to be doing better?
I would say you have somebody here, Dave Stovall, out there in the audience, who I think epitomizes this kind of work. I mean, sorry to call on you, Dave. Dave's, you know, he's a professor here, but he's also teaching in a high school here in Chicago Public Schools. And, you know, because when you talk about role model, you have to actually be present in their lives, interacting with them on a regular basis in order to be the model. Otherwise, you're just this person who, you know, makes an occasional appearance, but you're not going to have influence. It's the people who spend time with them who ultimately have the influence. And I would say that what we've got to do is figure out, okay, how do we build those kind of relationships and then really work with them and are addressing the tough issues they face. Right? I mean, anybody who's spent any time working with young people who live in the inner city knows just saying no to drugs is not a solution. Right? You've got to actually talk about alternatives. How do you support yourself without succumbing to a life of crime? How do you navigate your relationship with teachers who may be afraid of you, who may be biased? How do you do that work, right? And it helps if there are adults around who can, based on their own experience, based on the wisdom they've gained over the years, help young people to figure this stuff out. Because what we see is a lot of young people are out there asking these questions, but they don't have the guidance from people who understand how they see the world. And that's the key part, is that we've got to, a lot of adults have trouble, even when they share the same racial background as the kids, they have trouble remembering what it was like to be them and understanding what those young people are seeing, what obstacles they're seeing. And it's only by being able to see the world through their eyes that we can begin to help them figure out how to navigate more effectively.
You know, I agree, and the only thing I perhaps would add, I mean, as we think about this, particularly with regard to young people who are still engaged in school, like the ones that they may be engaging on a daily basis, I think you know, the perspective that Pedro presents is right on target. But I also think that we also have a lot of young males who have already dropped out and given up. And in many instances, as the discussion earlier was mentioned about the whole notion of the large numbers of individuals who are incarcerated or leaving. I mean, we also have to think about mentoring young people who are returning, who I would kind of view as returning citizens to their families and their communities in ways that help them to be able to re-engage in rather positive ways, to try to, in some ways, build from some of the experiences they had early on that in many instances got them off track. And so I don't want to write off an entire generation, because I think there's been far too many who've been the victims of detention and incarceration. And while they need mentoring, they need a different kind of mentoring. Because I'm seeing more and more, even among those, some who return home and become actively engaged in their own personal development and the development of their families and their communities. In some instances, if you've not, even after spending time, if you've not forgiven yourself for those circumstances or recognize the fact that in some ways your release represents your fulfillment of what at least the justice system has kind of determined what you need to do, then it's very difficult, even if you get the GED or complete college or even graduate school, to move forward, because you find yourself continuously in need of this, what I kind of view as a form of aftercare that is very much present. I also think that in many ways this mentoring also needs to go far beyond just the individual, because returning back to the very environment that in many instances led to the detention of incarceration, in many instances contributes in some ways to the high recidivism rates that we're experiencing. So mentoring, yeah, from this kind of preventive standpoint, I think as a nation, we don't put enough of emphasis and resources in terms of the kind of the prevention kinds of things that we could do, and so many people fall through the cracks. But as we see more and more people falling through the cracks and coming back for a second chance, we also need to think about how it is that we do this kind of restorative mentoring in some ways that also gives them opportunities to engage as well.
No, absolutely. And I hesitate when I use the word mentoring. I'm like, I never use the word mentoring. Where did that come from? But because there's so many connotations that, yeah, of that. And I often talk about, hopefully there are no students in here because they're going to be like, she's talking about that again. But I often talk about how one of the best societies, the best lessons that we teach as a society, adults to young people, is how to drive a car. And because it's very participatory, right? We do it in stages. We understand everybody drives a car in a different way, you know, all these things. And it's very much, there's social value in people being able to know how to drive, you know, their own lives, right? So it's you know, we have an esteemed Ella Baker scholar here in the room, and we talk about Ella Baker a lot. Barbara Ransby, we talk about her a lot. The Freedom School being a great adult ally, and really allowing young people the space to develop their own ideas and ways of doing things. So certainly that would be ideal in the situation of encouraging young males of color to start to learn how to drive their own lives effectively. My last question has to do with, I guess, the programmatic applications to the research. And so there's a local same-sex high school for black males that will go unnamed, that has gotten a lot of attention in the media for creating environments for success, quote-unquote success for black males. And there's controversy, of course, about their approach, but I'm wondering how the research speaks both to the internal practices of initiatives like this, as well as the framing of the public's understanding of these types of initiatives. So, you know, talked a little bit about media and the media spin, but there's also the media spin on what's working, too, and whether or not that's working. So I'm wondering how the research speaks to initiatives on that scale, because there's more than one of these high schools now in the city, and of course there's replication happening around the country.
We actually did, that school is part of a national study we've been doing on single-sex schools, so I know the school well. And you know, I've been approaching this phenomena of separating boys of color with skepticism. In fact, we wrote an article called An Intervention in Search of a Theory, right? Because what is the theory behind separating these young men? And it's often rooted in the idea that these young men are a problem and they need to be, you know, corralled together. Now, but it's done with the best of intentions. But often those intentions are never really critiqued and studied. So, and at that school, it's interesting, because there's a lot of pseudoscience out there about boys, right? And about, you know, this one guy, the Gurrian Institute, boys have different brains and learn differently. And it's not based on any kind of real science, but they're kinesthetic learners, right? And so this school, they had a practice at one point of when a student would raise their hand, they would throw a football to him. Right? And the idea that was somehow going to make them more engaged. That's right. And then they start realizing, guess what? Some kids can't catch. Right. And now they're embarrassed because everybody can see they can't catch the ball, so people start making fun of them. And the principal realized, you know what, I couldn't catch. And I was one of those kids, and why did we do that? Why? Because they had not even thought about what does male socialization need to look like? What about black male masculinity may be contributing to the high rates of violence, low performance in school? What do we need to do differently? What's interesting is that with young women, and there are a number of schools for young women. In fact, there's a young women's leadership school here in Chicago, with great outcomes. there is a much clearer theory about what girls need. Right? They need leadership, they need science, they need math, they need their voice. They need to not be defined by narrow gender roles. There's no clear sense of what boys need. And so, in fact, when you just create these schools, one of the things we're seeing is no thought given to making sure there's good teaching, making sure there's a sound curriculum, or what kind of socialization needs to go on to break some of the patterns so that men do not fall victim to this idea the only thing they could be is a rapper or a ball player. And I think so. Even as I would support, and I do support, some of the schools that have developed that are offering real alternatives and do have good academic outcomes for young men. Not because I think that's the best way, but just because those are good schools. But I'm still nonetheless skeptical of this idea that the best way to educate young men is to isolate them. Prisons isolate them too, and they're not that good.
Yeah, it's in many ways it's heartening to hear Pedro's comments, because being someone who's not an education scholar in that regard, early on in the creation of that school, I raised those same concerns with the school's founder in terms of simply putting all males together in a learning environment doesn't necessarily yield for you the kinds of things. And while I too share any enthusiasm that helps to advance opportunity and develop human capital for these young males, I think that there are also some real concerns that are raised in potentially same-sex high schools in terms of the social construction of masculinity, and that in some instances become really hypersexual and have very diminishing social and redeeming value for those young men when they exit those environments and have to go into environments where they're also having to negotiate space and involvement with females and others. And so it is, I agree that while that, you know, it may be for some that this is kind of really good and it allows for them an opportunity to kind of develop themselves in ways that perhaps being in other settings might be distracting. I'm still kind of waiting myself to kind of see the results in terms of how this works out. You know, my anecdotal experience with regard to this in terms of individuals that I know whose sons have gone there have been mixed, quite honestly. I mean, we hear a lot about the individuals who feel that it is a wonderful environment, but there are some who found it not to be so good for their sons. And so, and in some instances, some of the practices that are being promoted run contrary to what parents sometimes want their young males to kind of think about and develop. And so I think in large measure what we want to do is create the kind of environments that allow for individuals not to have to think about separation and segregation in some kind of ways, whether it be along gender lines or racial lines, whatever, so that they can develop and see the greatest fulfillment across all different spheres.
In addition to the internal practices, what needs to be added to the public discourse around examining the effectiveness of such programs and such initiatives?
Well, you know, I kind of think about it in the same way as I thought about the recent recommendation to, in some ways, extend the school day in the public schools. I mean, you extend it by 40 minutes, but if what you're doing is not necessarily anything better than what you're doing the other time during the day, then extending it doesn't necessarily yield for you the outcome. And so I think that, and I've seen the piece that Pedro and his colleagues wrote in terms of this notion about a practice that's in search of a theory, and I think that that's right. I think that in doing something like that, there needs to be some justification, you know, beyond the fact that it seems like a good thing to do, because there's a lot at stake here. You know, in terms of whether or not what we are actually in some ways kind of doing is is contributing to the continuation of a kind of gendered notion about superiority and stuff, and it only can be recreated in certain kinds of settings. But I do think at the same time, I think it is really important to have those conversations, you know, and they're not the easiest conversations to have. Part of that, I think, is due in part because of the fact that in the public schools in Chicago, there's been more of a negative kind of perspective about what you can expect in terms of what education can yield. And given the large numbers of African American males who actually, for example, are part of those failing statistics, that people are just searching and grasping for something that seems like it has some promise. But there's still reason and justification for having this kind of caution about whether or not this is the best way to do, because you have to, in some ways, kind of think about it in the same way you might think about the Harlem Children's Zone. Sounds like a great thing on paper, but the amount of resources that are required to do it really raises the question of whether it could be replicated in any kind of way that it could yield the same kind of success in multiple places. And so this is one of these clear examples where research can be useful, but one of the things that we often are concerned about stuff is not only representativeness, but its ability to be replicated. And I don't know that in all these instances, what we might be seeing in some of these educational settings that are all sex, whether they are all male or all female, are necessarily the kinds of things that can be and should be replicated across groups.
Thank you.
Thank you. Don't go away. We are going to take a few questions from the audience, and I'm thinking that maybe we'll take 2 or 3 and then give the panelists a chance to respond kind of to the pieces of them. I'm going to ask that your questions be short questions, the short version of your long story that you wanted to ask the panelists, including asking about the Chicago Freedom School and some of their very impressive work here on the ground. And then the panelists are going to give short answers to those questions, and then we'll have time for discussion afterwards. Okay?
So I actually have it's going to sound like many questions, but it's actually just one question. It just has different parts to it. So I want to thank the panel. All 3 of you, I think, bring something really different, and I respect all the work, and we're particularly happy that Pedro's back on our campus again. So I want to ask this question of Pedro. When you started off talking about the need for class analysis, I'm with you 100%. But I also think we need to speak to the dangers of sort of a colorblind class analysis. We had Sahoj Zizek on campus recently, and he was introduced with a rather bizarre introduction, which was he was praised for being the kind of intellectual who can talk about class unchaperoned by race, class, and gender. And that makes me very nervous, and I think there are really repercussions to that, and I think we should talk about it. And the other question is just part of the question is about the role of sort of Black and Latino studies programs. And there's a way in which those programs can certainly be marginal and peripheral and, kind of navel-gazing, I suppose. But some of the best programs in the country, and I think we have excellent ones on this campus, are ones that do embrace kind of feminist intersectional analysis that really looks at not only diaspora, but looks at class and gender and sexuality inescapably. And so by definition, you're looking at the world and you're looking at a multi-dimensional analysis of oppression and not just a narrow definition of race. So I'm just hoping that you still see a place in the academy for those kinds of programs. And I'll stop there.
So on the first question about absolutely class and race have to, I think, always be seen in this country in tandem. And the intersection, just in terms of this recession right now, what you're seeing is the impact is disparate, right? That is on African American Latino communities. So if we only had a class analysis, we would not be able to recognize that. Now, it's also been called a man session, too, right? That is that men have disproportionate impact on the economy, and we need to understand, okay, why? What is there about the way in which the labor market works that would result in men being at a place of disadvantage. So I think that their race, class, gender, and lots of other ways in which sexuality, they come into play. We need to deploy them as being a part of our analysis as they help us to understand the phenomena that we're looking at. And we shouldn't, I mean, so the idea of post-racialism in America, I mean, to me is, we're not even close to being in such a state. So with respect to the ethnic studies, I by no means want to minimize the importance of the kind of work being done by scholars in those departments. What I'm really calling for is saying, let's not just settle with being in those departments. Right? I think that we need to infiltrate the whole university. And what concerns me is on a lot of campuses, people have been satisfied with saying, okay, we got our Black studies, women's studies, ethnic studies, and we got it covered. And meanwhile, the mainstream is untouched. And that, to me, is the problem, is that we need to completely infiltrate what is now still seen as the mainstream and move away from the margins. So that rich analysis, that rich work that's going on there in Black studies needs to be in English, it needs to be in sociology, it needs to be in public policy, it needs to be throughout the university, not simply in those departments.
And in many instances, to both questions, it's a both and, right? That in fact, both kinds of work has to go on. Are there any other questions? Yeah?
Just a point of information for Pedro. There are no more Robert Taylors or...
I know.
And it contributed to the Darian Albert situation because you put 25,000 young people into communities with a different culture. Those places had their own culture, so that contributed to that. And sometimes, in my imagination, I wonder, when they closed those housing developments, did anybody have any kind of policy or thinking ahead to find out what impact that would have on the young people? And then I work on the ground and I'm in that community. The question I have for you is, in this technological advanced society, it seems like industrial education has been put on the back burner. And being a homeowner, I'm looking for people all the time to do something. And our kids are standing on the corner and don't know how to use a hammer and a nail. So that's one of the questions. Is there any movement or any policy to reinstitute industrial education? And the other one I want to know, are there any statistics that show that removing, quote unquote, the cream of the crop of students, putting them in special schools and leaving all the other schools, leaving all the other students in the school, what effect that has on the school as a whole?
Can I ask you to just hold your responses? Let's get the brother one last question that maybe we can integrate in some way so that we can...
I think my question was a little bit different in nature, but in the same vein. We spoke a little bit about including, so a lot of the discourse today has been about African American males and young African American males. And I look around the room and I don't see very many, myself included in that category, in the young part. But so what I'm asking is, it's great that we have these conversations in the academy, and I love sitting here in the nice seats and the beautiful room, but the people that we're talking about, the people that we're addressing, the people that we find, to be dealing with these issues aren't represented not only in this room, but are seldom represented in our work. So I'm asking, how can we move the conversation out of Harrison and Morgan and move it to 79th and Halsted, or move it to K-Town, or move it to Argyle Gardens or Roseland, right? There are communities where these conversations should take place, but we seldom engage in this conversation in those spaces. So just talk a little bit.
Thank you. So to the extent that you can answer, because we're also important questions too. Thank you.
So I would say on this question, and I think while it would be better asking about this impact of closing the project that it's had, I was contacted actually right after the killing of the young man by a school board member in Chicago who asked me, could I come to the board meeting to talk about what had happened? I said, well, I live in New York City, and I don't know a lot about what happened. I said, but I would encourage you to talk to some young people from Chicago who live in that neighborhood about what's happening, because I think that's the voice you really need to be listening to. And so I think, speaking to your point, I think you're absolutely right, is if we don't find a way to engage them in this conversation, then nothing's going to happen. I was asked to go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where there was just a large number of juvenile homicides. And they said, please come and help us figure out what to do. And I said, well, I will come on one condition. And that is that in the room you have the church leaders, the business leaders, the education leaders, the police, and the young people. Because if you don't have young people in the room, then you're not going to even get close to even understanding what it is you're dealing with. And so that's, I think, a huge problem, is we are having these conversations, but the actual actors that we're trying to influence are not in the conversation. And guess what? It's not working. So I think we need to rethink how we're approaching this. I think you're absolutely right about industrial education, what they call it, or technical preparation. We need to be preparing young people for the jobs of the future. We have focused almost exclusively on college preparation when we know very well, let me just ask, how many college students who were here are working while you're in school? I mean, it's not college or work. They're working through school. So the question is, do they have the skills that are going to allow them to support themselves both while they're in school and then beyond? And as you point out, there is work there. But a lot of times we have not provided the skills in the area. And I would say that renewable energy, biotechnology, there's a lot of areas where we really think creatively and strategically, how do we make sure young people get those jobs? And then lastly, I think this issue that you described of separating young people based on ability is a big part of the problem. Right? That is, and it's one of the things we're seeing across the country. And Jaime and I were talking earlier about charter schools. We didn't get a chance to finish that conversation. I'm not against charter schools, but I am concerned about the tendency to use charter schools as another way to screen out the hard-to-serve children. Right. Because one of the things we know very well is when you concentrate the kids who have the most problems together, you get more problems. You actually, diversity in all of its forms is a good thing, because you need people around who are modeling, good students' behavior for those who don't know what that looks like, and that's actually helpful. Going back to this point about boys again, there's a school in Harlem, Thurgood Marshall. They figured out the best way to help young men was to have 9th grade boys mentored by 12th grade girls. Because the 12th grade girls are organized, and those 9th grade boys pay attention, right? And it's working for them, right? So, it's rather than separate boys, let's pair them up with some girls who actually know how to do school.
I would very much agree with you that, one of the things that, I think that, not one of the things, that our major finding in doing this media examination of the Darian Abbott situation was the fact that the violence was just the tip of the iceberg with regard to what's happening here. It was a result of bad school policies that kind of led to the closing of the public school in the area, and but also public housing policy, failed economic policies. When you think about all of these things in tandem, it creates a kind of environment that kind of makes for it very difficult for anyone to kind of survive. And so your point about whether or not this is a good thing in terms of, I would agree, whether separating, I don't think so. I mean, I grew up in a setting where there may have been subgroups in a classroom, but for the most part, everyone was together. And believe it or not, even as someone who might have been kind of characterized as a gifted student in some regard, there were things that I learned from the students who were not necessarily in my group, but in terms of, I modeled, in certain kinds of ways that was very useful, sometimes in the classroom, but even more so outside of the classroom. And so I think that the idea that somehow arranging classrooms or schools by achievement certainly does have its disadvantages. In some instances, they may be far more so in terms of helping young males. And this may be also a part of what we saw with regard to Darian Allen in terms of, in some ways, his inability to navigate the community options that had become available to him, even though he was kind of viewed in terms of the way in which he was characterized as being this great student.
Mia Henry, do you want to have the last word? Something about Chicago Freedom School?
Oh, no, I just...
Well,
I mean, it's just a pleasure to be here, to hear from both of you, and I think it's really exciting that there are opportunities like this for people who are working with young people directly to be in conversation with those who are doing the really important research that has the potential to influence policy. So I'm really just grateful that you all are here, and you all are here, and I feel very blessed, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Michelle Boyd, for putting things together, including ordering the food for the reception. So we invite all of you to stay around for a little while, talk to each other, and our panelists will be here for a few more minutes as well. So thanks again for coming.